How you doing there? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Samach Dalet, Daf 64 of Masechta BavaBasra. Friends, we're just going right into BavaBasra be'etzem. Today we get into the sugya of mocher ba'ayin yafa u'mocher or ba'ayin ba'ayin ra'a u'mocher. This is a sugya that we got into a shtickle in Chezkas Sabatim, and I think this is probably the main sugya over here. It's going to be very interesting. Let's go. I don't think it's going to be a huge daf. Okay, here we go. Says the Mishnah on Daf Samach Dalet Amud Aleph, about, I don't know, maybe 2/5 of the way through the Amud. Says the Mishnah, Lo es habor velo es adus, af alpi shekasav lo umke virume. We learned about this yesterday, that so if you sell a house, I guess there were like different potential ways to learn it yesterday. Okay, but we'll do it. Let's stick with the simpler way, I think. If you sell a house, right? So Shimon sells his house to Reuven. The pit or the cistern is excluded from the sale. The house is included. Apparently, the property is included, but not. Oh, that's interesting, because there was a whole shaila about there's the ground beneath. But it seems like from the Mishnah, the assumption would be that the this is talking interesting. This is interesting stuff. This is interesting stuff. So if you sell the thing, so you said by default, that is included. But interesting. Okay, I'll koponim, or maybe what if there isn't any property? That's not an interesting shaila. Okay, I'm only thinking about this now, which is why I'm like getting caught up, but. Because it sounds like from here that be'etzem, the house is included, the property is included, but the pit and the cistern are excluded, right? So we say, right, lo es habor v'lo es adus, right? So if you sell the house, so the house is sold, but the pit and the cistern are not sold. Shimon keeps those. Afal pi shekosav lo umke virume, and even though Shimon wrote to Reuven, I'm selling you the depths and the heights, still the pit and the cistern are excluded. V'tzorich likach lo derech divrei Rabbi Akiva. Now Rabbi Akiva says that even though Shimon retains the right, he retains the ownership over the pit and the cistern, nonetheless, how's he going to get to the pit and the cistern? Because he's got to walk on the property to get to the pit or the cistern. But he sold the property, which is why I'm like, wait a second, what's going on here? Because it sounds like included in the sale of the house is also the property. Now, if you say that Memela included in the sale of the house is also the property, so Memela umke v'rum is included. In which case, if you say umke v'rum is, so then maybe the pit and the cistern should be included. And if you say that I don't know. Or maybe what it's saying is that by default, maybe Hitaka didn't write. Oh, isn't that actually what we said yesterday? Hitaka didn't write Umke Vruma. So maybe that's pshat. But it says that he did write Umke Vruma, so we said that you have to read it in. That Taka makes more sense, I guess. I guess that makes sense, actually, the way that we learned it yesterday. Which is that if you sell the house, so then also the property is sold as well. And now, if that's all you wrote, then it would just be the house and the property, but not the umkevruma, but not the pit and the cistern. If you want to sell the pit and the cistern, you'd also have to write umkevruma. But if you don't write it, so then what's included? The house and the property, but not the pit and the cistern. Okay, so let's stick with that. Hopefully I can't say I think that makes sense. Hopefully it makes sense. Okay, anyways, we are talking about a scenario where Shimon sells his house and his property to Reuven, but he still owns the pit or the cistern. Now, great. Shimon owns the pit or the cistern, but how does he get to the pit and or the cistern? Because let's just choose one, the pit. He's got this, so he still owns this pit on the property, but to get to the pit, he's going to have to walk on the property to get to the pit, but he doesn't own the property. He owns the pit, doesn't own the property. So says Rabbi Akiva that Shimon's going to have to work it out with Reuven to be able to get to his pit. Because Reuven owns the property that the pit is in. So again, lo es habor v'lo es hadus. So the pit or the cistern are excluded from the sale of the house and the property. Even though he wrote umkevruma, okay, so I guess that we'll probably read it like we read it yesterday, that if he writes it, then it does include the pit in the cistern, but he needs to write it in order to include it. If he doesn't write it, then it doesn't include the pit in the cistern. Fine. Fine. So Rabbi Akiva says, since all Shimon still owns is the pit, or the cistern, but he doesn't own the property around the pit, so he needs to make a separate deal with Reuven to now get access to the pit. Whereas the Chachamim say, no. The Chachamim say, and that's going to be the discussion of today's daf, but the Chachamim say that, no, if Shimon retains the pit, so Mamele he also retains a little path to get to the pit as well. Umoder Rabbi Akiva, now Rabbi Akiva admits, Bizman she'omelo chutz me'elu she'ein tzorich likach derech. Rabbi Akiva does agree though that since Memele the pit and the cistern are excluded, right? If he sells the house, the pit or the cistern are excluded automatically. So if Shimon explicitly says, I'm selling you my house, but not the pit or the cistern, well, in that case, he didn't need to say that because automatically it isn't included in the sale anyway. So why did he say, but not that I'm retaining the pit and the cistern? It means not just the pit and the cistern, but also a path to get there. So again, Umoder Rabbi Akiva admits, and he agrees, that Bizman she'omer, if Shimon explicitly said, even though he didn't need to explicitly say, but if he did explicitly say, chutz me'elu, that I'm selling you the house, but not the pit or the cistern, he didn't need to say that. Memele, the pit or the cistern are excluded anyways. But if he explicitly says that, well, she'ein tzarich likach derech, that he's not going to now need to negotiate a path to the pit, because by saying, except for the pit and the cistern, he's saying the pit and the cistern and a path to get there. Michoron le'acher. If it's fakir, if Shimon did not sell Reuven the house, Shimon sold Reuven the pit. He's just selling Reuven the pit. So Rabbi Akiva Omer Eino Tzarich Likach Lo Derech. So Rabbi Akiva assumes, okay, if Shimon is selling Reuven the pit, he's not just selling Reuven the pit, he's also selling Reuven a way to get to the pit. V'chacham Omer, as the Chacham say, Tzarich Likach Lo Derech. No. If he sells the pit, he's just selling the pit, not any of the area around it, and Reuven's going to have to figure out how to get to the pit. He's going to have to make a deal with Shimon. Fine. Yosef Ravina, wait 1 second. Let me do something here. Hopefully I'm not making a mess. Yeah, that's good. Okay. Yosef Ravina, says the Gemara, Ravina was sitting, he was asking a kasha, no, isn't a pit and a cistern, aren't they the same thing? Ravina says, Rava Tosva to Ravina, Tashma Kamanir the Tanya, we're learning about say, Echad Abor, Ve'echad Adus, Bekarka. Yes, both a pit and a cistern are in the ground. But the difference is, a pit is in like harder ground. So all that is required to make the pit is to dig, but the pit itself will retain its structural integrity. Whereas a cistern is in softer ground, whereas if all you do is, dig it, well, it's not, I guess it's not going to hold water very well. You have to then, put like plaster in it or, some kind of thing to like, hold its, structure so that the water won't like be absorbed in the ground. And I don't know. I'm not like a builder guy, but, I guess you have to like, dig and then you got to like, plaster it or something to make the structural integrity in a cistern. Alright. Yosef Rav Ashi v'Kakashli, if I understand correctly, basically Rav Ashi has the same back and forth. Rav Ashi was wondering, Hainu Bor Hainu Dus, aren't a pit and a cistern the same thing? Amalei Mark Shisha Beit Rav Chisda Rav Ashi, Tashmad Tanya Echad Abor Vechad Adus Bekarka, both a pit and a cistern are in the ground. Elish Abor Bechafir Vadus B'Minyan, but a pit, all you need to do is dig it, and a cistern, you not just dig it, but you have to then build, some kind of lining for it, plaster, chvaistish. Alright. Oh, So now we're going to try to understand the machlokas between Rabbi Akiva and the Chacham. We just, right, in the Mishnah, we clearly saw that there was an interesting machlokas between Rabbi Akiva and the Chacham. Okay? Shimon sells Reuven his house and the property, but he keeps the pit. The shaila, so Rabbi Akiva says, well, now Shimon's got to figure out how to get to the pit. The Chacham say, ma pitom. Of course he retains a way to get to the pit. And then we say, if he sells only the pit, Rabbi Akiva says, well, Reuven's going to have to, so Memele, Reuven included in the sale Shimon included in the sale a way for Reuven to get to the pit. And the Chacham say, ma pitom. No, he didn't. He only sold Reuven the pit and that was it. So, I like that. The pit and that's it. 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 That's got to be a good slogan for something. Cheva, what's that going to be the slogan for? The pit and that's it. The pit and that's it. The pit and that's it. It's got to be good for something. All right. Cheva, you're ready on WhatsApp, all right? Okay. Okay. Oh, Givalt. This is Mamash Givalt. Okay, so we need to understand this machlokas. Here we go. So let's say that the machlokas between Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim is the Rabbi Akiva saw mocher ba'in yafe mocher. We saw this machlokas in what's it called in Cheskas Habatin. Rabbanan saw mocher ba'in ra mocher. Rabbi Akiva, maybe you remember this now. Rabbi Akiva assumes that sellers in general are generous, and the Chachamim assume that sellers in general are ungenerous. I don't know if that's a word, but it means the opposite of generous. They are selling the minimum amount. They're selling the minimum. So therefore, Rabbi Akiva says that if Shimon sells his house to Reuven and the property, but he retains ownership over the pit, Rabbi Akiva assumes that Shimon as a seller is a generous seller. He's selling Reuven the maximum, the house, and all the property. Shimon retains, however, the pit, but all the property surrounding the pit, he does not retain. It's Reuven's. He generously gave Reuven everything. And now Shimon is in a position where he needs to go back to Reuven and renegotiate how to get to his pit. Whereas the Chacham say, punkt fakert, that a seller is an ungenerous seller. That if he's going to retain the right to the pit, of course he's going to also retain for himself a way to get to the pit. He did not include that in the sale. He's an ungenerous seller. So we want to say that's the machloikes between Rabbi Akiva and the Chacham. Rabbi Akiva says that mocher ba'ayin yafe mocher, and the Chacham say mocher ba'ayin ra'a mocher. So again, from the top of the Amud, Rabbi Akiva is Savar, Rabbi Akiva holds mocher ba'ayin yafe mocher, that a seller is a generous seller, v'abonon savre, whereas the rabbis hold mocher ba'ayin ra'a mocher, that a seller is an ungenerous seller. Dennis, what's the opposite of generous? Alright. Now, and in general, when we come back to this concept that, of course, Rabbi Akiva's shita is mocher ba'ayin yafe mocher, like we saw in Cheskas Habatim. We said Rabbi Akiva's shita in general is mocher ba'ayin yafe mocher. Whenever we say that, it's from mehocha, it is from this sugya of the pit. The pit, and that's it. But no, according to Rabbi Akiva, I guess Shimon retains the pit, and that's it. Okay, fine. So now, one second. One second. We're going to challenge this basically until the end of the Amud, okay? Alright, we just said that, okay, so I said the machlokes between Rabbi Akiva and the Chacham is, Rabbi Akiva says mocher ba'ayin yafe mocher, the Chacham say mocher ba'ayin ra'a mocher, and we're going to keep on trying to push it off and explain the machlokes differently. We're going to have a few different scenarios now. So, maybe you can explain actually the machlokes between Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim with regard to the house, and Shimon retaining the pit, and Rabbi Akiva says he doesn't retain the path, and the Chacham say he does retain the path. Maybe there's something else going on here, which is Dilma, Rabbi Akiva Sovar, maybe Rabbi Akiva holds, Ein Adam Rotze Sheyiten Ma'osa V'Yidresu Achem V'Rabanan Saver Ein Adam Rotze Sheyito Moz V'Yifrach Ba'aver. Maybe there's a it's not about Mocher Ba'ayin Yofe Mocher, Mocher Ba'ayin Ra Mocher. It's conceptual. It's conceptual. That Rabbi Akiva says, look, if Reuven is investing in this property, he's buying a house, he's buying property, of course he does not want that after he becomes the owner of this house and this property, that Shimon is going to be coming and walking on his field, on his property to get to his pit. Of course, from Reuven's perspective, he wants this purchase that once it's his, nobody else is trespassing, and Shimon knows this. Shimon obviously knows that when he's selling his house and his property to Reuven, the assumption is that that he's selling everything, and therefore it's Reuven's responsibility that if he wants to be able to get to his pit, he's going to have to work that out with. If Shimon wants to get there, he's going to have to work it out with Reuven, because by default it's total. It's 100%. It's 100%. Whereas the Chachamim's svara is it makes no sense that Shimon is going to sell his house and his property, but maintain a pit. But in order to get to his pit, he needs to strap on a jetpack and fly in the air to get to his pit because he's not allowed to walk there. That's ridiculous. So the Chachamim say that Mele, if Shimon is keeping the pit for himself, is also keeping a place to get there. It's a svara. It's not davka ayin mocher b'ayin roa mocher. It's logical. The Chacham would argue that if Shimon is retaining the right to the ownership of the pit, Mimele, he's retaining a way to get there. You can't expect him to put on a jetpack and fly. So again, Dilma, maybe it's a svara. Maybe it's not about mocher b'ayin yofe mocher, mocher b'ayin roa mocher. Maybe you can just explain it logically, which is that Rabbi Akiva says that the logic is so for ein adam rotze, that Reuven doesn't want shritin ma'osav, that he's going to pay all this money for this house and this property, v'yijesu acherim, and other people are trespassing on his property. V'rabanan savri, and the rabbis say, but wait, from the perspective of Shimon, ein adam rotze shito mos, Shimon doesn't want that he's, going to sell his house and his property and receive the money, but keep the pit, and yet v'yifrach ba'avir, and now, but in order to get to his pit, he's going to have to fly there. Insane. So he retains the way to the pit. Okay, fine. Let me say, fine. Okay, fine. So if we want to say that from the Reisha we can't infer mocher b'ayin yafa mocher b'ayin ra mocher. All right. So let me say, but what about the next part of the Mishnah, where we said that if it's fakert, if Shimon only sells the pit but keeps everything else, so Shimon only sells the pit. So Rabbi Akiva says, included in the sale of the pit is oichit, a path to get to the pit. And the Chachamim say, no, Shimon only sold the pit. He did not include a path to the pit. And a path to the pit. A path to the pit, and that's it. 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 You can put like a rhythm on that. A path to the pit, and that's it. A path to the pit, and that's it. So anyway, okay. So the Chachamim say that Shimon is selling only the pit, and that's it. No path. Reuven's going to have to figure out how he's going to get there. Okay, fine. So let me say from Mecharin La'acher, okay, first wide line, that if Shimon sold only the pit, and that's it, Rabbi Akiva Omer says, Rabbi Akiva, Einu tzarich likach lo derech, the path is included in the sale, and Reuven does not need to negotiate with Shimon how to get to the pit that he bought. The Chacham say tzarich, that they do need to negotiate because the path was not included. So let's say that the machlokes is, Rabbi Akiva says, mocher b'ayin yafeh mocher, that Shimon is a generous seller, and therefore he included in the sale of the pit a path to the pit. And the Chacham say that mocher ba'in ra'a mocher, that a seller is an ungenerous seller, and he sold only the pit and nothing else. And therefore, Reuven needs to negotiate with Shimon how he's going to be able to get to the pit. But again, we say, wait, maybe there's a svara here. Maybe it's not mocher ba'in yofeh mocher, mocher ba'in ra'a mocher. Maybe the machlokas is Rabbi Akiva sover basur daite dilokeach ozlinon v'Rabbanan sover basur daite democher ozlinon. Maybe the machlokas is that, right, meaning if you say mocher ba'in yofeh mocher, mocher ba'in ra'a mocher, so everything's coming from the perspective of the seller. But maybe the machlokas between Rabbi Akiva and the Chacham is, are we looking at it from the perspective of the seller, or are we looking at it from the perspective of the buyer? We could say that Rabbi Akiva says, we look at it from the perspective of the buyer. That the buyer, it's in his interest to buy not just the pit, but a path to the pit as well. So that's what's included. Whereas the Chachamim are viewing it from the perspective of the seller. The seller wants to sell as little as possible, just the pit, and that's it. So again, so Rabbi Akiva saw that Rabbi Akiva holds that we go based on the interest, on the intentions of the desires of the purchaser, and that is to buy not just the pit and that's it, but the pit and a path to it. The pit and is there like a path word that rhymes with pit? The pit and the Let's go weiter. Rabbanan Savin, the rabbis hold, we go based on the intentions of the seller, and the seller is selling just the pit, and that's it. And Reuven therefore is going to have to negotiate how he's going to get to the pit. How he's going to get to the pit. Rather from here, we have a Mishnah, I think. I think it's a Mishnah on Ayin Aleph from Aleph. Lo es habor v'lo es hagas v'lo es hashoivach. If a fellow sells a field, I think that's what we're talking about. Does it say that over there? Amochas asada? Is there? Am I skipping a Mishnah? What's this? Amochas asada. Yeah. So it's talking about if a person sells a field. So up until now we're talking about selling a house. If a person selling a field. So lo sabor, it does not include a pit. V'lo sagas, not a wine press. V'lo sashovach, not a dove coat. Ben charevin, ben yeshuvin, whether the pit has water in it or not, whether the wine press is near a vineyard or not, whether the dove coat has doves in it or not, they're excluded. V'tzarich likach lo derech. Dira B'kiva. And Shimon, if he's selling the field, but he keeps the bor, gas, shovach for himself, a path to get there is not included. Rabbi Akiva says that he needs to negotiate, Shimon needs to negotiate with Reuven how he's going to get to his gas, to his bor, or his gas, or his shovach. Fine. Whereas the Chachamim say Shimon does not need to negotiate because he kept a path for himself. Hasulamali. Why do we need to teach the same halacha, the same machlokas between Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim by the field? Seems like the same exact thing. So elalav or kamashblon, what is being repeated is, the reason why it's repeated is to teach us Rabbi Akiva savar mocher ba'in yofeh mocher v'Rabbanan savar savrei mocher ba'in ra'a mocher. It is to teach us. It's being doubled, apparently superfluously, to teach us this concept that Rabbi Akiva's shita is mocher ba'in yofeh mocher, and Rabbi Chacham's shita is mocher ba'in ra'a mocher. But maybe it's not extra. It's not superfluous. The first example was in the context of a house. The second example was in the context of a field. Maybe we need to learn both scenarios, right? So you can have like the same machlokas by the house, it will be by the field. That the Rabbi Akiva says that, if Reuven's buying it, he intends, he doesn't want Shimon trespassing, and the Chachamim say that Shimon's not going to keep possession over his pit or his wine press or his dovecote and have to fly with a jetpack to get there. It's the same machlokas. Utzrich, and you need to teach the machlokas both by a house and by a field, because the ashminun bayis, because if we would only have the house, so then I can understand why Rabbi Akiva would say that Shimon would have to negotiate how to get to the pit. Mishum de bayitz niusa, because a house is a place where people want privacy, and therefore if Reuven is buying a house from Shimon, Memele is going to want to have privacy. He's not going to want to have Shimon walking around there, and therefore Shimon's gonna have to negotiate with Reuven how he'll be able to get to his pit. Aval Sodeh Eimalo, but I'll say by a field, Reuven doesn't really care as much as he does in the house, and maybe Rabbi Akiva would say that Shimon wouldn't have to negotiate with Reuven how to get to his pit. If all we would have is the field, maybe that's where Rabbi Akiva says that Shimon needs to negotiate with Reuven how to get to his pit. Mishum dekashi le'davsha, because in a field where you're going to be planting and growing, people trespassing and walking there and stepping on the field can ruin the crops. So therefore I understand why Shimon's going to have to negotiate with Reuven how he can get to his pit on the field. Aval bayis, but in the house, Eimalo, where that isn't the concern, so maybe Shimon would not need to negotiate with Reuven according to Rabbi Akiva. So therefore we need both cases, the house and the field, to teach that the machlokes in Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim applies in both, but it's not necessarily mocher b'ayin yafeh mocher or mocher b'ayin ra mocher. It could be, what's the expectation of the buyer and the seller. So elemi seifa, rather from the seifa of that other Mishnah, that is definitely superfluous. Mucharin la'acher, that if all Shimon sold to Reuven was the pit or the wine press or the dovecote, that's all he sold to Reuven. So Rabbi Akiva Omer Eino Tzarich Likach Lo Derech. So Rabbi Akiva assumes that the path to the pit, to the wine press, to the dovecote is included. The Chacham say that it is not included, and Reuven would have to negotiate with Shimon how he's going to get to his pit, to his wine press, to his dovecote. Hasulamali, why do I need the seifa by the field? Hainuhach, it's the same thing as the Reisha, and if it's to teach us, well, I need to learn about the house, I need to learn about the field, we already made that bridge from the Reisha of the Seifa. So why do we need the Seifa of the Seifa? We already know the Svara from the Seifa of the Reisha. So Hainuach Elalab, Hokamashmad Rabbi Akiva Savar, Mocher B'ayin Yofeh Mocher, Rabbanan Savi, Mocher B'ayin Ra Mocher, Shmamina. Rather, it is superfluous to teach us that Rabbi Akiva's Shita is that Mocher B'ayin Yofeh Mocher, and the Chacham's Shita is Mocher B'ayin Ra Mocher. Chevre, that was Daf Samach Daled of Masechet BavaBasra. Hope you enjoyed. Peace out.